The summer of 1886 had been merciless to Dodge City, Kansas. The sun beat down on the dusty streets like a hammer on an anvil, and the Arkansas River ran lower than anyone could remember. But on this particular evening, as purple clouds gathered on the horizon, the air crackled with the promise of rain and something else entirely. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story." Jack Mercer sat atop his favorite ridge, a half-mile outside town, watching the storm approach. At 43, his weathered face told stories he'd never spoken aloud. Deep lines carved by sun and sorrow framed eyes the color of winter sky, and his calloused hands bore scars from 1,000 encounters with wild horses and wilder men. The townspeople called him Loner, though never to his face. He preferred it that way. Thunder rumbled across the prairie as Jack's horse, a sturdy bay named Ranger, shifted nervously beneath him. The first fat raindrops began to fall, each one striking the parched earth like a small explosion. Jack pulled his hat lower and was about to head back to his modest cabin when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm like a knife through silk. A child's scream. Jack's blood turned to ice. The sound came from the direction of the river, now swollen and angry from the sudden downpour. Without hesitation, he spurred Ranger toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Arkansas River had transformed into a raging beast. What had been a gentle stream just hours before now roared with deadly fury, carrying debris and foam in its churning embrace. And there, clinging to a fallen cottonwood branch in the middle of the torrent, was a boy. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his small frame barely visible above the dark water. His mouth opened in another terrified cry, but the storm swallowed his voice. Jack could see the boy's strength failing, his grip on the branch loosening with each passing second. "Hold on," Jack shouted, though he knew the boy couldn't hear him over the roar. He dismounted and began stripping off his gun belt and boots. The water was moving too fast. One wrong move and they'd both be swept away. Jack tied his rope to Ranger's saddle horn and secured the other end around his waist. The horse was trained for this kind of work, steady as granite even in a storm. Taking a deep breath, Jack plunged into the icy water. The current hit him like a freight train, threatening to tear him away from his lifeline. The rope burned against his ribs as he fought his way toward the boy, stroke by desperate stroke. Debris slammed into him, branches, rocks, pieces of someone's fence, but he pressed on. "I'm coming, son," he called out when he was close enough. The boy's eyes, wide with terror, locked onto his. They were the deepest brown Jack had ever seen, filled with a pain that went far beyond the immediate danger. Jack reached the branch just as the boy's grip gave way. His arm shot out, catching the child around the waist as the current tried to claim them both. The boy was lighter than expected, all bones and wet clothes, but he clung to Jack with surprising strength. "I've got you," Jack gasped, water filling his mouth. "Hold tight." The journey back to shore was a nightmare of churning water and burning lungs. Jack's muscles screamed in protest as he fought the current, one arm wrapped protectively around the boy, the other pulling them along the rope. Ranger stood firm on the bank, his hooves planted like anchors in the mud. When they finally reached the shallows, Jack collapsed onto the muddy bank, the boy still clutched against his chest. Both of them were shaking from cold, from exhaustion, from the proximity of death. The child's lips were blue, his small body racked with violent shivers. "What's your name, son?" Jack asked gently, pulling off his own shirt to wrap around the boy's shoulders. The child looked up at him with those haunting brown eyes but said nothing. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. A tremor that had nothing to do with the cold ran through his small frame. "It's all right," Jack murmured, lifting the boy onto Ranger's back. You're safe now." But as they rode toward Dodge City, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that safety was the last thing waiting for them in town. The first sign of trouble came at the edge of Main Street. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, took one look at the boy in Jack's arms and stepped back as if she'd seen a ghost. Her face went white as fresh snow, and she crossed herself before hurrying away without a word. "Strange reaction," Jack muttered, but he pressed on toward the doctor's office. Dr. Samuel Morrison was a good man, one of the few in town who treated Jack with genuine respect. He took one look at the shivering child and ushered them inside without question. "Found him in the river," Jack explained as the doctor began his examination. "Storm caught him somehow." Dr. Morrison's hand stilled for just a moment when he saw the boy's face clearly in the lamplight. His expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral in a way that set Jack's nerves on edge. "He'll be fine," the doctor said after a thorough check. "Cold and exhausted, but no serious injuries. What's your name, young man?" Again, the boy remained silent, those dark eyes darting between the two men like a trapped animal seeking escape. "Shock, most likely," Dr. Morrison murmured, but Jack caught the uncertainty in his voice. "He'll need warm clothes, food, and rest." "The orphanage?" "No." The word came from Sheriff Willard Knox, who had appeared in the doorway like a dark omen. At 55, Knox was a man who wore authority like armor, his badge gleaming against his black vest. But tonight, there was something else in his weathered features, something that looked almost like fear. "Sheriff?" Dr. Morrison's eyebrows rose in question. "The orphanage is—" "Full," Knox said, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "Has been for weeks. You'll have to make other arrangements." Jack felt his jaw tighten. "The orphanage has been advertising for donations because they need more children to qualify for state funding. I saw the notice myself just last week." Knox's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt. "Are you calling me a liar, Mercer?" The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we could discuss this outside?" But before anyone could move, the door opened again and Abigail Reed stepped into the office. At 28, she was the town's only trained nurse, a woman whose gentle nature was matched by an iron will when it came to caring for those in need. Her auburn hair was damp from the rain, and her green eyes immediately found the boy. "I heard there was a child in need," she said softly, approaching the examination table. The boy's eyes tracked her movement, and for the first time since the rescue, some of the fear seemed to leave his face. "Miss Reed," Knox said, his voice carrying a warning. "This doesn't concern you." Abigail's chin lifted in defiance. "A child's welfare always concerns me, Sheriff." She knelt beside the boy, her voice gentle as morning rain. "Hello, sweetheart. Can you tell me your name?" The boy's mouth opened, and for a moment, Jack thought he might speak. Instead, he reached out with one small hand and touched Abigail's cheek as if testing whether she was real. "Billy," he whispered, so quietly they almost missed it. "Billy Cooper." The effect of those two words was electric. Dr. Morrison stepped back as if struck, and Sheriff Knox's face went ashen. Even Abigail seemed shaken, though she quickly composed herself. "Billy Cooper," Knox repeated, his voice hollow. That's not possible." "Why?" Jack demanded, his patience finally snapping. "What's so damned important about this boy's name?" Knox's eyes met his, and in them, Jack saw something he'd never expected from the tough lawman: genuine terror. "Because Billy Cooper died 20 years ago," Knox whispered. "Died in that very same river, along with his entire family." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the doctor's office, time seemed to have stopped. The boy Billy looked from face to face with those haunting brown eyes, and Jack realized that whatever secrets Dodge City was hiding, this child was at the center of them all. As thunder crashed overhead, Jack made a decision that would change everything. He stepped forward and placed a protective hand on Billy's shoulder. I don't care what happened 20 years ago, he said firmly. This boy is alive. He's here, and he needs help. If nobody else will take him, then I will. Sheriff Knox shook his head slowly. You don't understand, Mercer. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Jack's eyes hardened like winter steel. Then maybe it's time someone told me. But as the storm raged outside and secrets swirled like shadows in the lamplight, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that some truths were buried so deep they might just kill anyone foolish enough to dig them up. The boy's small hand found his, and Jack squeezed gently, making a silent promise. Whatever darkness lay ahead, whatever secrets Dodge City was hiding, he wouldn't let this child face it alone. The storm was just beginning. The morning after the storm dawned clear and merciless, the Kansas sun already promising another scorching day. Jack had spent the night in Dr. Morrison's office, dozing fitfully in a chair while Billy slept on the examination table. The boy had barely stirred, exhausted by his ordeal, but when he did wake, those dark eyes immediately sought Jack's face. "Morning, son," Jack said gently, offering a cup of water. "How are you feeling?" Billy accepted the water with both hands, drinking slowly while studying Jack over the rim. When he finished, he set the cup down carefully and spoke in that same whisper-quiet voice. "Are you going to leave me too?" The question hit Jack like a physical blow. There was such resignation in those young eyes, as if abandonment was simply the natural order of things. Jack knelt beside the table, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "No, Billy, I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, carrying a bundle of clothes. "These should fit," he said, though his manner remained strangely distant. "Mrs. Patterson donated them from her store." As Billy changed into the clean clothes, simple brown trousers, a white shirt, and a small vest, Jack noticed the doctor's continued unease. "Doc, what's really going on here? Last night you looked like you'd seen a ghost when the boy said his name." Morrison glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "Jack, there are things about this town, things that happened before you arrived. The Cooper family ... He paused, struggling with his words. "It was a tragedy that shook Dodge City to its core." "What kind of tragedy?" Before Morrison could answer, the office door burst open. Sheriff Knox entered, followed by two men Jack recognized but had never formally met. Silas Barton, the wealthiest landowner in the county, and Mayor Thomas Caldwell. Silas Barton was a man who commanded attention without trying. At 60, he was still imposing, with silver hair and cold gray eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they saw. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as a man of considerable means and influence. "Mercer," Barton said without preamble, "we need to talk." Jack instinctively moved closer to Billy, who had gone very still at the sight of the visitors. "About what?" "About the boy," Mayor Caldwell interjected. He was a nervous man, thin and balding, who always seemed to be sweating regardless of the weather. "There are ... complications." "What kind of complications?" Barton stepped forward, his presence filling the small office. "The kind that could be very dangerous for everyone involved." "Including you." Jack felt his temper rising. "Are you threatening me, Barton?" "I'm trying to save your life," Barton replied coolly. "And his." He nodded toward Billy, who had pressed himself against the wall as if trying to disappear. Sheriff Knox cleared his throat. "Jack, what Mr. Barton is trying to say is that this situation is ... complicated. The boy can't stay in Dodge City." "Why not?" "Because," came a new voice from the doorway, "some secrets are too dangerous to let live." Everyone turned to see Abigail Reed entering the office. She carried a basket of food and medical supplies, but her face was set with determination. Behind her stood an elderly man Jack didn't recognize, tall and gaunt, with wild white hair and eyes that seemed to see too much. "Miss Reed," Mayor Caldwell said nervously, "you shouldn't be here." "Neither should any of you," she replied sharply, intimidating a man who saved a child's life. She moved to Billy's side, offering him a gentle smile. "How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart?" Billy looked up at her with something approaching trust. "Better," he whispered. The elderly man stepped forward, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. "My name is Ezra Whitman," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "I was the town preacher 20 years ago when the Cooper family died." Jack studied the old man's face. "You know what happened to them." "I know what the town wants people to believe happened," Whitman corrected. "The truth is something else entirely." Silas Barton's face darkened. "Ezra, you're playing with fire." "Fire's already been lit," the old preacher replied calmly, the moment this boy spoke his name. He turned to Billy, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. "Tell me, child, do you remember your parents?" Billy nodded slowly. "Mama had yellow hair. Papa played the fiddle." His voice grew even quieter. "They said they'd come back for me." The silence that followed was deafening. Jack saw tears in Abigail's eyes, while Dr. Morrison had gone pale as parchment. Even Sheriff Knox seemed shaken. "That's impossible," Mayor Caldwell stammered. "The whole family died in the river." "We all saw the bodies. Did you?" Whitman asked pointedly. "Or did you see what you were told to see?" Barton's hand moved to his coat, and Jack tensed, ready to protect Billy if necessary. But the wealthy landowner simply pulled out a leather wallet. "Mercer," Barton said, counting out bills, "here's $500. Take the boy and leave Dodge City. Today. Don't ask questions. Don't look back. Just go." Jack stared at the money more than he'd seen in 2 years of honest work. "What makes you think I'm for sale? Every man has a price. Not this one." Jack's voice was steel. "And you still haven't told me why everyone's so afraid of one small boy." Ezra Whitman tapped his cane against the floor. "Because Billy Cooper isn't just any boy. He's the living proof of the biggest lie this town ever told." Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts and the sound of running feet filled the street. Dr. Morrison moved to the window and peered out. "There's a crowd gathering," he reported. "Looks like half the town." Sheriff Knox cursed under his breath. "Word's gotten out about the boy." Jack moved to the window and looked out. Indeed, a crowd was forming in the street, men, women, and children, all talking in hushed, urgent tones. Their faces showed a mixture of fear, curiosity, and something else Jack couldn't quite identify. "They're scared," Abigail observed, joining him at the window. "Of a 10-year-old boy?" "Of what he represents," Whitman said quietly. "Of what his survival means." Billy had climbed down from the examination table and now stood beside Jack, his small hand finding the cowboy's larger one. "They don't want me here," he said with heartbreaking matter-of-factness. Jack squeezed the boy's hand gently. "Well, I do. And that's what matters." Silas Barton shook his head. "You're making a mistake, Mercer, a dangerous one." "The only mistake," Jack replied, "would be letting fear make my decisions for me." The crowd outside was growing larger and more agitated. Jack could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the window words, like "cursed and unnatural and should have stayed dead." "This is getting out of hand," Sheriff Knox muttered. "I need to disperse them before." His words were cut off by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had thrown a rock through the window of the general store across the street. The crowd's murmur turned into an angry buzz. "We need to get Billy out of here," Abigail said urgently. "Where?" Jack asked. "You heard Barton, they want us gone entirely." Ezra Whitman stepped forward. "There's a place. My old cabin up in the hills. It's been abandoned for years, but it's solid. You could stay there while we figure this out." "We?" Jack raised an eyebrow. The old preacher's eyes were fierce despite his age. "I've been carrying the weight of what happened 20 years ago for too long. Maybe it's time the truth finally came to light." Another rock flew through the air, this one striking the doctor's office window. Billy flinched and pressed closer to Jack. "All right," Jack decided. "We'll go to the cabin. But I want answers, Whitman. All of them." "You'll have them," the preacher promised. "But first, We need to get you both out of town before this crowd turns into a mob." Abigail gathered her supplies quickly. "I'm coming with you." "Miss Reed," Mayor Caldwell protested, "that wouldn't be proper." "Neither is letting a child be terrorized by a mob," she shot back. "Billy needs medical attention, and I'm the only trained nurse in 50 miles. Dr. Morrison nodded reluctantly. "She's right. The boy should be monitored for at least another day or two." As they prepared to leave, Jack noticed Billy staring out the window at the crowd. The boy's face was pale but determined, far too serious for someone his age. "Billy," Jack said gently, "are you all right?" The boy looked up at him with those haunting dark eyes. "They're afraid because they think I'm dead. But I'm not dead, am I?" "No, son. You're very much alive." Billy nodded slowly. "Then why do I remember being in the ground?" The words sent a chill through everyone in the room. Outside, the crowd's anger was growing, and Jack realized that whatever secrets Dodge City was hiding, they were about to become very dangerous indeed. As they prepared to slip out the back door, Ezra Whitman caught Jack's arm. "There's something else you should know," the old preacher whispered. "The night the Cooper family supposedly died, Silas Barton was the one who found the bodies. And he was the one who insisted they be buried immediately without a proper investigation." Jack's blood ran cold. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that 20 years ago, this town buried its conscience along with those bodies. And now that conscience has come back to haunt us all." As they slipped into the alley behind the doctor's office, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than an angry mob. They were walking into the heart of a 20-year-old lie that someone had been willing to kill to protect. And now that Billy Cooper had returned from the dead, that someone might be willing to kill again. The abandoned cabin sat like a weathered sentinel among the pine trees, 2 miles up a winding trail that most folks had forgotten existed. Ezra Whitman had led them there by a circuitous route, avoiding the main roads where angry townspeople might be searching. The old preacher moved with surprising agility for his age, his cane finding sure footing on the rocky path. Billy had ridden in front of Jack on Ranger, his small body tense with exhaustion and confusion. During the journey, he'd asked only one question: "Why do they hate me?" Jack had no answer that wouldn't terrify the boy further. The cabin was larger than Jack had expected, built of solid logs that had weathered decades of Kansas storms. Ezra produced a key from his coat pocket and opened the heavy wooden door. "I built this place myself, back in '64, he explained as they entered. "Thought I might retire here someday, away from the politics and gossip of town life." His laugh was bitter. "Guess I was more prophetic than I knew." Abigail immediately set about making the place habitable, her nurse's training evident in the efficient way she organized their supplies. Billy sat quietly on a wooden chair, watching her work with those unnaturally observant eyes. "Now," Jack said once they were settled, "I want the truth. All of it." Ezra Whitman lowered himself into a chair across from Jack, his weathered hands folded over his cane. "The truth is uglier than you might imagine, son. And it starts with a lie that's been eating at this town's soul for 20 years. "What lie?" "That the Cooper family died by accident." Whitman's eyes were distant, lost in painful memories. Thomas Cooper was a good man, a farmer with a small spread about 5 miles south of town. His wife, Mary, was the prettiest woman in 3 counties, with hair like spun gold and a voice that could make angels weep, and their boy. He looked at Billy, who was listening intently. Their boy was the light of their lives. Billy's small voice broke the silence. "What happened to them?" Whitman hesitated, glancing at Jack and Abigail. "Are you sure you want to hear this, child?" Billy nodded solemnly. "I need to know." The old preacher sighed deeply. "Thomas Cooper discovered something he shouldn't have. Something that certain powerful men in Dodge City wanted to keep buried." "What kind of something?" Jack pressed. "Land fraud. Claim jumping on a massive scale." Whitman's voice grew harder. Silas Barton had been buying up properties from desperate farmers for pennies on the dollar, using forged documents and intimidation. But Thomas Cooper was smarter than most. He kept records, documented everything. He was planning to take his evidence to the territorial authorities. Abigail looked up from where she was tending to Billy. So Barton killed him? Not directly. Barton's too smart for that. Whitman shook his head. He hired men drifters, the kind who'd do anything for money and disappear without a trace. They were supposed to make it look like an accident. Jack felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. The river. The family was coming back from Sunday service when they were ambushed. The killers forced their wagon into the river during a flash flood, made it look like they'd been caught by rising water. Whitman's voice dropped to a whisper. But something went wrong. What do you mean? The boy survived. Whitman looked directly at Billy. You survived, didn't you, child? Somehow, you made it out of that river alive. Billy's face had gone very pale. I remember the water, he said slowly, and the dark. And being so cold. He paused, his young brow furrowed in concentration. There was a man. He pulled me out. What man? Jack asked gently. I don't know. He was big, with kind eyes. He said he'd take care of me, that I'd be safe. Billy's voice grew smaller. But then there were other men, angry men. They said I had to go away, that I couldn't tell anyone what I saw. Abigail knelt beside Billy's chair, taking his small hands in hers. What did you see, sweetheart? Billy's eyes filled with tears. I saw Papa and Mama in the water. They weren't moving. His voice broke. The bad men said they were sleeping, but I knew they weren't sleeping. Jack felt rage building in his chest like a wildfire. So what happened to Billy? Where has he been for 20 years? Whitman stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. That's where the story gets even darker. Someone in town, someone with a conscience, couldn't bear to see the boy killed, so they made a deal with Barton. What kind of deal? Billy would disappear. Officially, he died with his parents, but in reality, he'd be sent away, far from Dodge City, to live with people who'd never know his real identity. Whitman turned back to face them. In exchange, the evidence Thomas Cooper had gathered would disappear too. But Billy's here now, Abigail pointed out. How is that possible? Billy spoke up, his voice stronger now. The people who took care of me ... They died last month. Both of them in a fire. I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I started walking. I knew I was supposed to find my way home, but I didn't know why. Jack stared at the boy in amazement. You walked all the way from wherever you were to Dodge City? I think so. It took a long time. I slept in barns and ate what I could find. Sometimes people gave me food. Billy's eyes grew distant, but I kept having dreams about the river, about Mama and Papa. The dreams told me to come home. Jesus, Jack breathed. You're just a kid. You could have died out there. I almost did, Billy admitted. That's why I was in the river when you found me. I was trying to cross, but the water was too fast. Whitman returned to his chair, looking every one of his 70-odd years. So now you know the truth. Billy Cooper is living proof that Silas Barton is a murderer and a thief, and Barton knows it. That's why he offered me money to leave town, Jack realized. He's trying to make the problem disappear again. Except this time, it won't be so easy, Abigail said firmly. Billy's not a frightened child anymore. He's old enough to testify, to tell people what really happened. If anyone will believe him, Whitman said grimly. Barton's had 20 years to consolidate his power. He owns half the businesses in town, has the mayor in his pocket, and Sheriff Knox. What about Knox? Jack demanded. Whitman hesitated. Willard Knox was the deputy sheriff 20 years ago. He was one of the men who found the bodies in the river. Jack felt the pieces clicking into place. He was part of the cover-up. I don't think he had a choice. Knox was young then, ambitious. Barton probably offered him the sheriff's position in exchange for his cooperation. Whitman's expression was pained. Good men sometimes make bad choices when they're desperate. Outside, The wind was picking up, rattling the cabin's windows. Jack stood and checked the door, making sure it was securely barred. The isolation that had seemed like protection now felt ominous. "There's something else," Billy said quietly. "Something I remembered while you were talking." They all turned to look at him. The boy's face was pale but determined. "The night my parents died, I heard the bad men talking. They said something about papers, about hiding them where no one would ever look." "What kind of papers?" Jack asked. "The ones Papa had. The ones that proved the bad man was stealing." Billy's eyes were bright with sudden understanding. "They didn't destroy them. They hid them." Whitman leaned forward intently. "Do you remember where?" Billy nodded slowly. "In the place where they put Mama and Papa. In the ground with them." The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. "The evidence is buried with your parents?" "That's why Barton insisted on immediate burial," Whitman said, his voice filled with wonder and horror. "He wasn't just covering up murder, he was literally burying the evidence." Abigail stood up, her face set with determination. "Then we have to dig it up." "Are you insane?" Jack stared at her. "You're talking about grave robbing." "I'm talking about justice," she replied firmly. "Those papers could prove everything, the land fraud, the murders, all of it. Even if we could get to them, even if they're still intact after 20 years, double quotes." Jack shook his head. "Barton would never let us get that far. He'd kill us all first." "Maybe," Whitman said quietly, "but maybe not. You see, there's one thing Barton doesn't know." "What's that?" The old preacher's eyes gleamed with something that might have been hope. "He doesn't know that I kept copies of some of those documents. Thomas Cooper gave them to me for safekeeping, just in case something happened to him." Jack felt his heart skip a beat. "You have evidence?" "Some. Not enough to convict Barton on its own, but enough to corroborate whatever we might find in that grave." Whitman stood up, suddenly looking years younger. "And there's something else. Sheriff Knox might be willing to help us." "Why would he do that?" "Because 20 years is a long time to carry guilt. And because Willard Knox is fundamentally a good man who made one terrible mistake." Whitman moved toward a trunk in the corner of the cabin. "I've been waiting for this day for 2 decades. Waiting for the truth to have a chance." As the old preacher began pulling documents from the trunk, Jack looked down at Billy. The boy was watching everything with those 2 wise eyes, and Jack realized that this child had already seen more darkness than most adults ever would. "Billy," Jack said gently, "are you sure you want to do this? It's going to be dangerous." Billy looked up at him with absolute trust. "You saved me from the river. Now we have to save Mama and Papa from the lies." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that another storm was coming, one that would either wash away 20 years of lies or drown them all in the process. The truth was finally within reach. The question was whether they'd live long enough to grasp it. Dawn broke gray and cold over Dodge City, casting long shadows across the cemetery where Thomas and Mary Cooper had been laid to rest 20 years ago. Jack stood at the edge of the graveyard, his breath visible in the crisp morning air, watching Sheriff Knox approach with 2 deputies and a reluctant gravedigger named Pete Hawkins. The night had been long and tense. Ezra Whitman had spent hours poring over the documents he'd hidden for 2 decades, while Abigail tended to Billy's emotional wounds with the same care she'd shown his physical ones. The boy had slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of dark water and angry voices. "I still think this is madness," Sheriff Knox muttered as he joined Jack. The lawman looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his face drawn with the weight of secrets finally coming to light. "Maybe," Jack replied. "But it's the right kind of madness." Knox had surprised them all by agreeing to help. Whitman had been right about the sheriff's conscience. 20 years of guilt had eaten away at the man like acid. When confronted with the truth about Billy's survival and the evidence Whitman possessed, Knox had broken down completely. "I was young and stupid," he'd confessed in the cabin. "Barton promised me everything: the sheriff's job, money, a future. All I had to do was look the other way when they found the bodies. I told myself the Coopers were already dead, that nothing I did could bring them back. Now, as they prepared to exhume the grave, Knox seemed like a man seeking redemption through action. Billy stood beside Abigail near the cemetery gate, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill. He'd insisted on being present, despite everyone's protests. "I need to see them," he'd said with heartbreaking simplicity. "I need to say goodbye properly this time." Ezra Whitman hobbled over to join them, leaning heavily on his cane. "Pete's ready to start digging. But we need to be quick. Barton's bound to notice we're missing soon enough." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the cemetery. Jack's hand moved instinctively to his gun as a group of riders appeared on the horizon. Silas Barton and 6 of his men, riding hard toward the graveyard. "Too late," Knox muttered, his own hand finding his weapon. Barton reined in his horse at the cemetery entrance, his cold gray eyes taking in the scene. His men spread out behind him, hands resting on their gun butts. The wealthy landowner looked every inch the predator he was, dressed in black like an undertaker come to claim the dead. "Sheriff Knox," Barton said, his voice carrying across the morning air. "I'm disappointed. I thought we had an understanding." Knox stepped forward, his badge catching the weak sunlight. "The only understanding I have is with the law, Barton. And the law says murder is murder, no matter how long ago it happened." Barton's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Murder? You're talking about an accident that happened 20 years ago. Ancient history." "Not so ancient," Jack said, moving to stand beside Knox. "Not when the victim's still alive to tell the tale." Barton's eyes found Billy, and for just a moment his composure cracked. "That boy is an orphan with a head full of fantasies. Nothing more." "Then you won't mind if we dig up this grave and see what's buried with the Cooper family," Whitman said, stepping forward with surprising courage. "I mind very much." Barton's voice turned deadly. "That's desecration of a sacred resting place. I won't allow it." "You don't have a choice," Knox replied, pulling out a folded paper. "I have a court order from Judge Harrison in Wichita. This exhumation is legal and proper." Barton's face darkened. "Harrison's an old fool. This order won't stand up in a real court." "Maybe not," Jack said, "but it'll stand up long enough for us to find what we're looking for." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Barton's men shifted nervously, outnumbering Jack's group but facing a sheriff and his deputies. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. Then Billy stepped forward, his small voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Mr. Barton," he said, looking directly at the man who had destroyed his family, "why did you kill my mama and papa?" Barton's horse danced sideways as if sensing its rider's agitation. "I never killed anyone, boy. Your parents died in an accident." "No, they didn't." Billy's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I remember now. I remember everything." He began walking toward Barton, and Jack moved to intercept him, but the boy held up a small hand. "I was hiding in the wagon when the bad men came," Billy continued, his young voice carrying across the cemetery with startling clarity. "They had guns, and they made Papa drive into the river. One of them had a scar on his face right here." He touched his own cheek. "And another one had a gold tooth that shined when he smiled." One of Barton's men, a rough-looking character with a distinctive scar, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Another man, sporting a prominent gold tooth, actually took a step back. "The boy's making it up," Barton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Billy asked. "Then how do I know about the papers? The ones Papa hid in his coat before the bad men came? The ones that proved you were stealing land from people?" Barton's composure finally shattered completely. "Enough," he roared, drawing his gun. "I've heard enough of this nonsense." But Sheriff Knox was faster, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced ease. "Drop it, Barton. It's over." For a moment, the cemetery was frozen and tableau guns drawn, horses stamping, the very air crackling with violence. Then Abigail did something that surprised everyone. She began to sing. Her voice rose clear and pure in the morning air, carrying a hymn that Jack recognized from his childhood. It was a song about redemption, about truth conquering darkness, and it seemed to cast a spell over the entire scene. Billy joined in, his young voice harmonizing with hers, and even some of Barton's men seemed affected by the haunting melody. In that moment, surrounded by graves and drawn guns, something shifted in the atmosphere. 20 years, Sheriff Knox said quietly, his weapon still trained on Barton. 20 years I've been carrying this weight. I'm not carrying it anymore. Barton's gun wavered, then slowly lowered. The fight seemed to go out of him all at once, leaving him looking older and smaller than before. You don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for anyone to die. I just wanted the land. Cooper was going to ruin everything with his evidence. So you had him killed, Jack said flatly. I hired men to scare him, to make him back down. But Cooper fought back, and things got out of hand. Barton's shoulders sagged. When they told me the whole family was dead, I thought it was finished. Then they said the boy had survived, and You made him disappear, Whitman finished. Just like you made the evidence disappear. Barton nodded slowly. I thought it was over. I thought everyone was safe. Everyone except the Coopers, Billy said quietly. Everyone except my family. The gravedigger, Pete Hawkins, had been working steadily throughout the confrontation. Now he called out from beside the grave, Sheriff, you better come see this. They gathered around the excavated grave, leaving Barton under guard with his men. What Pete had uncovered made them all gasp in amazement. The wooden coffin had partially collapsed over the years, but it had protected its contents from the worst of the elements. And there, wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked inside Thomas Cooper's coat, was a leather portfolio thick with documents. Whitman carefully extracted the portfolio with shaking hands. 20 years, he breathed. 20 years this evidence has been waiting. As he opened the portfolio, papers spilled out deeds, contracts, correspondence, and most damning of all, a detailed ledger in Thomas Cooper's careful handwriting documenting every illegal land transaction Barton had orchestrated. It's all here, Knox said in wonder. Every crime, every theft, every fraud. Enough to put Barton away for the rest of his life. Billy knelt beside the grave, looking down at the remains of his parents. Tears streamed down his young face, but there was peace there too, the peace of finally knowing the truth. I'm sorry it took so long, he whispered, but we found them. We found the papers that will make the bad man pay. Abigail knelt beside him, wrapping him in a gentle embrace. Your parents would be proud of you, Billy, so very proud. As Sheriff Knox placed Silas Barton under arrest, the sun finally broke through the morning clouds, casting warm light across the cemetery. The long night of Dodge City's shame was finally ending. 3 months later, Jack stood on the porch of his newly expanded cabin, watching Billy play with a litter of puppies that Ranger had somehow acquired. The boy had grown in those months not just physically, but emotionally. The haunted look had faded from his eyes, replaced by the natural curiosity and joy of childhood. Abigail emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd given up her position in town to help Jack care for Billy, and if their relationship had deepened into something more than friendship, well, that was nobody's business but their own. Supper's ready, she called, and Billy came running, puppies tumbling after him. Silas Barton was serving a life sentence in the territorial prison. His men had been convicted as accessories to murder. Sheriff Knox, granted clemency in exchange for his testimony, had resigned his position and left Dodge City to start fresh somewhere else. And Billy Cooper, no longer an orphan, no longer alone, had found a new family in the most unlikely of places. As they sat down to dinner, Billy looked up at Jack with those dark eyes that no longer held pain. Jack, he said, do you think Mama and Papa know I'm happy now? Jack reached over and ruffled the boy's hair. I think they know, son. I think they've always known. Outside, the Kansas wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and the peace that comes when truth finally conquers lies. The storm had passed. The healing could begin. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.